On the morning of August 28, 1996, a clerk from Prince Charles's legal team walked into a side office of the family division in London, handed over a cheque for £20, and ended a 15-year marriage. No press conference, no ceremony. Diana, Princess of Wales, was not even in the building. 2 hours later, she was photographed at a lunch for the English National Ballet, wearing her diamond and sapphire engagement ring, smiling for cameras that had spent the morning trying to guess what she'd been paid to walk away. The number that eventually leaked was staggering for the time. A lump sum reported at roughly £17 million, more than $20 million, plus several £100,000 a year to run her private office. She kept her apartments at Kensington Palace. She kept joint custody of 2 future kings. The only thing she lost, formally, was 3 letters, HRH, which meant that from that day forward, Diana would have to curtsy to the family she'd just left. 4 months earlier, in May of that same year, another royal marriage had already been quietly dissolved in the same court system, between the same family, under the same monarch's authority. Sarah Ferguson, Duchess of York, walked out of her divorce from Prince Andrew with a settlement that, by even the most generous reporting, came to a small fraction of what Diana received, variously reported at somewhere between £300,000 and £3 million, depending on which parts of the deal you count and how you count them. 2 women, married into the same institution, divorced in the same year, walking away with numbers that don't belong in the same conversation. The tabloid version of that gap has calcified into a tidy morality tale. Diana played the palace and won. Sarah folded and lost. It's a satisfying story. It also skips almost everything that actually happened, and it flattens the one detail that makes this comparison worth making at all. Sarah Ferguson has said, repeatedly and on the record, that she didn't lose that money. She chose to leave it on the table. The real question isn't why she got less. It's what she thought she was buying with the difference, whether that purchase actually held up, and what the 30 years since have to say about a woman who tried to trade cash for belonging inside a family built to eventually let almost everyone go. To understand why these 2 settlements diverged so sharply, you have to go back further than 1996, to 1992. The year the Queen herself, in a rare moment of public candor, called her annus horribilis. It was the year both marriages effectively ended, though neither divorce would be finalized for another 4 years. Andrew and Sarah had separated that March, after a marriage strained almost from the start by his Royal Navy postings, which, for the first several years, left the couple able to see each other only a matter of weeks annually. Months later, in August, the tabloids published photographs of Ferguson on holiday in the south of France, her financial advisor, John Bryan, kissing her bare feet by a swimming pool, while her young daughters played nearby. The press dubbed it the toe-sucking scandal, and it did lasting damage, not just to her marriage, which was already over in every way but paperwork, but to her standing with the royal family and the public alike. Diana's marriage collapsed in full public view that same year for different reasons. Andrew Morton's biography, drawing on cooperation from Diana herself, though this wouldn't be confirmed until years later, detailed Charles's relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles and Diana's own struggles with bulimia and self-harm. Both couples announced formal separations within months of each other. Both women spent the next 4 years as quasi-royal, quasi-exiled figures, waiting for a legal process the Queen wanted finished and the tabloids wanted narrated in real time. The negotiations that followed those separations were not conducted on equal footing, and the difference wasn't really about how much either woman was loved by the family she was leaving. It was about leverage. And leverage in a divorce from an institution that survives on public affection comes from your ability to damage that affection if provoked. By the mid-1990s, Diana understood this better than anyone advising her. She had already sat for the 1995 Panorama interview with Martin Bashir, telling 22 million British viewers that there were 3 people in her marriage, undermining Charles's public standing in a single hour more than a decade of positive press could repair. She had a formidable divorce lawyer in Anthony Julius, better known at the time for his work in libel and human rights law than family law, but exactly the kind of adversarial mind the palace didn't want cross-examining its finances in open court. And she had the plain fact of who her sons were. William and Harry stood second and third in line to the throne. Diana was their mother, and no settlement could remove that. The palace had every incentive to make her departure generous, dignified, and, crucially, final, wrapped in a confidentiality agreement that kept the messiest details out of court. Reports at the time suggested Charles's own financial advisor was told to liquidate a substantial portion of the prince's personal investments to make the payment, a detail his aide would later describe to a newspaper in terms suggesting real strain on Charles's private finances. Whatever the exact mechanics, the family paid to make Diana's exit clean, because an unclean exit from a woman with her media instincts and her legal team was the far more expensive outcome. Sarah Ferguson had almost none of that leverage, and this is the part the "she chose friendship" narrative tends to skip past. She was not fourth in line to the throne's mother in the sense that mattered dynastically. Beatrice and Eugenie were princesses, but girls with limited prospects of ever sitting close to the throne, not the heir and the spare. She had no equivalent of the Panorama interview. If anything, the toe-sucking photographs had already cost her public sympathy years before the settlement talks began in earnest. And there was no single dramatic revelation she could hold over the family's head to force a larger number. She had also, by her own later accounts, already run up substantial personal debt well before the divorce was finalized, reportedly several £1 million by the mid-1990s, some of it settled by the Queen more than once, according to reporting on her finances from that period. A duchess who had already needed bailing out was not negotiating from a position of strength. And she did not have Anthony Julius. What she had, according to her own later telling, was a decision to make about what she actually wanted out of the rest of her life, and she has said in more than one interview across more than 2 decades that what she wanted was to stay inside the family's orbit rather than maximize what she could extract on her way out of it. The clearest version of that explanation came in 2010, when Ferguson sat across from Oprah Winfrey and was asked directly why her settlement looked so different from Diana's. Her answer became one of the most quoted lines of her post-royal life. She said she'd chosen friendship with the family, that she wanted friendship with the boss, meaning Queen Elizabeth, whom she has described across the years with unusual and consistent warmth for a woman who was, on paper, a former in-law with no further institutional claim on the monarch's affection. It's a compelling explanation, and there's no strong evidence it's insincere, but it also does a great deal of narrative work for a settlement that, by the numbers, looks less like a strategic trade and more like the outcome of a weak negotiating position, dressed afterward in the language of choice. The two things aren't mutually exclusive. Ferguson may genuinely have valued closeness to the family over cash, and she may also have had far less cash on offer, regardless of what she valued. The honest answer to what actually happened in 1996 sits somewhere in that overlap, and the rest of her life gives you the material to weigh it. What did she actually receive? The reporting is messier here than the tabloid one-liners suggest, and the mess is itself informative, because Ferguson herself gave contradictory accounts of her own settlement for years afterward, a fact that would later come back to embarrass her. According to details attributed to palace insiders and reported by British newspapers, the package included a sum in the region of $600,000 from the Queen to help her purchase a home for herself and her daughters, a further sum near $1 million placed into trust funds for Beatrice and Eugenie, rather than paid to Sarah directly, An unrestricted cash payment reported at somewhere around $400,000, and a monthly maintenance allowance calculated against Andrew's Royal Navy salary, a number that would rise and fall with his career rather than being fixed, and would obviously never rival a prince's private fortune to begin with. Andrew also committed to covering his daughter's school and university costs directly. Structurally, then, a meaningful share of the settlement wasn't money for Sarah at all. It was money for Beatrice and Eugenie, held in trust, technically theirs and not hers, even though she would later admit to relying on those very trust funds to get by. That detail matters more than it might seem, because it means the popular shorthand, "Diana got millions, Sarah got almost nothing," isn't quite accurate either. Sarah got very little in cash that was legally and permanently hers. What existed on paper for her family was real money, just money she couldn't freely spend on herself. The confusion around the true number wasn't only the press's fault. In 2010, Ferguson was caught in a secretly filmed sting by a tabloid reporter posing as a wealthy businessman, and offered him access to Prince Andrew, by then a UK trade envoy, in exchange for £500,000, telling him that money opens doors, and accepting a briefcase containing £40,000 in cash on camera. It was a scandal in its own right, and a serious embarrassment to the royal family, but it also produced, almost as a side effect, some of the only unguarded commentary Ferguson has given about her own finances. On that same recording, she described her divorce settlement as effectively worthless, at one point suggesting she'd received nothing at all, and at another moment, referencing a real annual figure closer to £20,000. She has told other interviewers other numbers at other times. The inconsistency doesn't prove she lied, so much as it shows a woman whose relationship to her own settlement has always been emotional as much as financial, sometimes framed as a point of pride, evidence that she chose grace over greed, and sometimes framed as a grievance, evidence that the family shortchanged her. Both framings appear in her own words, often within the same decade. What isn't in dispute is what happened to her financially in the years that followed, and it's here that the gap between the two women's settlements stops being an interesting footnote and starts functioning as the actual engine of Ferguson's next 3 decades. She did what a newly independent woman with royal connections and no independent fortune had to do. She went to work. She became the face of Weight Watchers in the United States, a deal reported to have earned her roughly $1.5 to $2 million, a genuinely significant sum that briefly outpaced anything the divorce itself had delivered. She fronted advertising for Ocean Spray, became a longtime spokesperson and dinnerware designer for Waterford Wedgwood, wrote a string of children's books, made television documentaries, and in 1996 published a memoir that added a further couple of $1 million to her accounts. On paper, this looks like a genuine second act, a woman who converted her royal notoriety into a durable commercial career, arguably more independent than a lump sum settlement would have made her. And for a stretch of years in the late 1990s, that reading holds. The trouble is that the lifestyle she was maintaining had been calibrated to a princess's household, not a working single mother's income, and the gap between the two kept reopening no matter how much she earned. By 2009, that gap had swallowed an American company she'd set up to manage her publishing, speaking, and media work in the United States, Hartmore LLC, which collapsed owing roughly $1 million, a failure that left her open to lawsuits from unpaid accountants and lawyers. A related UK-based venture folded around the same period, owing several £100,000 more. Royal watchers at the time described her as, in the blunt words of one biographer speaking to a British newspaper, simply desperate for money, not destitute, but chronically unable to bring her spending into line with her income, a pattern that had actually predated the divorce itself. Reporting from the mid-1990s already had her personal debts running into the millions of pounds, with the Queen quietly settling them more than once, even before the marriage legally ended. The 2010 cash for access sting, humiliating as it was, reads less like an aberration than a continuation of that same pressure finally breaking into public view. And it kept recurring. In 2011, it emerged that she had accepted roughly £15,000 to £20,000 from the financier and convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein, ostensibly to help pay off a former assistant's unpaid wages, a transaction she publicly called a gigantic error of judgment at the time. Emails surfaced far more recently, in 2025, showing a warmer and more urgent private correspondence than her public contrition suggested. Ferguson describing Epstein in one message as a steadfast and generous friend, and in another asking him directly whether she might borrow $50,000 or $100,000 to cover bills that were, in her words, pushing her over the edge. Epstein, citing legal restrictions on his own movements at the time, said he couldn't help until later that year. None of this proves that a bigger settlement in 1996 would have prevented any of it. Money doesn't fix a spending pattern. It just delays the reckoning. And there's a real argument, made by more than one royal biographer, that a woman who had already run up millions in debt before her divorce was finalized might well have run through a Diana-sized settlement too, given enough time and enough of the retinue she reportedly kept. At one point, by some accounts, 17 staff, including a driver and a cook, for a household with a fraction of Diana's independent income. That's a fair complication, and an honest account of this story has to hold it alongside the sympathetic version. But it doesn't erase the structural difference either. Diana's $22 million, however she managed it, was hers outright, insulated from any single relationship's survival. Ferguson's settlement was smaller, partly tied up in trusts for her daughters rather than liquid in her own name, and, more importantly for what comes next, was never meant to be the real foundation of her financial security at all. The real foundation, by her own account, and by the pattern of her actual life afterward, was proximity. Staying close to the family. Staying close, above all, to Andrew. That's the part of the story the settlement numbers alone can't tell you, and it's the part that makes friendship, not money, more than a talking point. Ferguson didn't simply stay cordial with her ex-husband after 1996. She kept living with him. In the years immediately after the divorce, she and her daughters remained in the marital home, Sunning Hill Park in Ascot, before moving to a rented house nearby. But by 2008, following a fire at the smaller property she'd been renting on her own, she moved into Royal Lodge, Andrew's official Windsor residence, taking a separate wing of the same house. They stayed there together, as exes, for close to 2 decades, a living arrangement so unusual that Ferguson herself took to describing them, more than once, as the happiest divorced couple in the world. It's a phrase that sounds like a joke until you notice what it was actually doing. It converted an arrangement most people would read as financial dependency, a woman without a home of her own moving into her ex-husband's grace and favor residence, into a story about warmth, resilience, and an unconventional but functional family. And for a long time, that story more or less worked. It kept her inside the institution's physical and social perimeter, even after her formal royal status had ended. It gave her housing security she wasn't paying for out of her own settlement. It gave her proximity to occasions, relationships, and a level of continued royal-adjacent standing that no 30-year-old cash sum, however large, could have purchased on its own. Which is exactly why what happened next matters so much to the verdict on her original choice. The arrangement that Ferguson had effectively substituted for a bigger settlement, closeness to Andrew, and through Andrew, continued proximity to the institution, was never something she owned outright. It depended entirely on Andrew's own standing inside the family holding, and in the autumn of 2025, that standing collapsed. As new material surfaced connecting him further to Jeffrey Epstein, King Charles moved to strip his younger brother of the Duke of York title and every other honor still attached to his name. Formal notice went out that October, ordering him to surrender the lease on Royal Lodge itself. Reports at the time made a point of noting that it was, in part, Sarah's own decision to move out on her own terms that finally pushed Andrew to accept the inevitable and give up the house they had shared for close to 20 years. By February 2026, following his arrest on suspicion of misconduct in public office, Andrew had relocated to private accommodation on the Sandringham estate, and Sarah, who had lost her own title of Duchess the same October her ex-husband lost his, was, by her own representative's account, looking for a place of her own for the first time since the divorce that was supposed to have made her independent 30 years earlier. Set that image against Diana's. Diana never lived to see her own 30-year mark. She died in a Paris car crash in August 1997, 13 months almost to the day after her divorce was finalized. But in the year she had, her settlement functioned exactly as designed. It was hers, unconditionally, regardless of whether Charles remained in royal favor, regardless of whether the institution itself thought well of her, regardless of any relationship she chose or abandoned afterward. It didn't depend on staying close to anyone. That's precisely what a clean, adversarial, fully monetized exit buys you. Durability that doesn't rely on anyone else's continued goodwill. Ferguson's arrangement bought something different, and for a long stretch, something that looked genuinely better. Family, warmth, a home, a place inside the world she'd married into even after the marriage was gone. But it was a purchase made on credit against Andrew's institutional standing, and when that standing was revoked, the collateral went with it. 3 decades after a settlement she has always described as a matter of values rather than leverage, Sarah Ferguson found herself, at 66, without the title, without the house, and, after Hartmore, after the cash for access sting, after Epstein, after a further multi-million-pound legal exposure connected to a failed theater investment company she'd once served as an executive director for, still without the kind of independent financial cushion Diana negotiated for herself in a single afternoon in 1996. So did Sarah Ferguson choose friendship over money, the way she's told the story for 20 years? Partly, and more honestly than most retellings allow. She did have less leverage than Diana, and no settlement negotiation happens in a vacuum where intentions alone set the price. A great deal of what she chose was simply what was on offer to a woman without a panorama interview, without Anthony Julius, and without an heir to the throne calling her mother. But it would be too easy and too convenient for the tabloid version of this story to say she had no choice at all. She has consistently declined, even in recent years, to formally renegotiate or press the family for more, reportedly consulting Diana's own divorce lawyer around the turn of the millennium about doing exactly that, and ultimately choosing not to. That's a real decision, made and remade across decades, not a single moment of weakness in 1996. What the settlement bought her wasn't nothing. It bought her 30 years of proximity, a shared home, a title she wore until last autumn, and a public relationship with the family that, whatever its costs, is not the story of a woman cast out. What it didn't buy her was security that could survive someone else's disgrace. That's the actual mechanism behind the headline, and it's less a story about who negotiated better in 1996 than about what kind of currency the monarchy was really trading in that year. Cash for the departures it needed to be final, and continued dependency for the departures it was content to keep, quietly, on a leash. Diana bought her freedom. Sarah bought her seat at the table. 30 years later, only one of those purchases turned out to be hers to keep.